WA hyphen KYENDO. We start. Hapo wapi? Nifinye wapi?
You still go to the document.
Uh-huh.
Where was it? Yeah. You press here for presentation.
Okay.
For it to go like that.
Ah.
Yes. And edit it umalize ndo
How many? 13. Yeah, he has not told me otherwise. Yeah, okay, it's not. Jairus, I think we can start.
Okay, thank you. Good morning and welcome to IES fifth webinar of 2026. And today we want to look at the lessons on policies from 2 decades of COMESA sugar safeguards for Kenya. And we'll have 2 presenters, that's Manuel Wachendo and Moses Mushiri, taking us through this. Over the years, IE has been holding webinars to discuss key policy discussions. And today, we are holding such a forum. So mostly we do research and organize public forums like this, again, to discuss key public affairs with the intention of influencing policy processes and policy outcomes to some good extent. And so we do this because we want to have, we have the desire to see Kenya that is prosperous, with an economy that is well managed, and people that enjoy increased economic and political freedoms for greater economic development. Therefore, in forums like this, we seek to increase public education, public knowledge on performance of Kenya's economy, and to expand or to increase the use of evidence in policy discussions. Therefore, we expect that at the end of this discussion, we'd have a better understanding of what has transpired for Kenya in the last 24 years in regards to the sugar safeguards under COMESA. This discussion is important because, as everyone else will say everywhere, agriculture is a mainstay of Kenya's economy. I think in the last available data, it's around 24% of Kenya's GDP. And the sugar sector is a key component or a key area of the agriculture contribution. If you look at the geography, you'll find that largely the western part of Kenya, that's Nyanza and western provinces, former provinces, and part of coast where we grow sugarcane. And therefore, this has consequences or impacts on incomes and greater, mostly incomes for people in these regions, especially the farmers. And also the sector employs a significant number of people, and we'll be able to see that in the data that will be presented by our two colleagues. The sugar sector also is an important one because today, I think a majority of us have taken tea with sugar in it. Those who don't have medical conditions, or at least you've interacted with sugar in one of the foods that you've consumed today or in your daily life. Therefore, it's an important discussion because it's something we can relate to. So our outline for today, we'll look at. We'll split this conversation in two parts. First, we want to just get a background of the COMESA trade arrangement, which Kenya is a member. Kenya is a member also of other international organizations, but here our focus is COMESA. And specifically, we want to look at when did Kenya join this sugar safeguard, COMESA sugar safeguard, and as our presenters will show us, actually what were the objectives for Kenya applying and applying for the sugar safeguards, which have been in place for 24 years. Therefore, after that, we want to understand actually what was provided under the sugar safeguards. And after that, second presenter will take us through the analysis. So we have created our second presenter will show us the methodology that we have settled on. Of course, we have an index to be able to analyze this, and we'll apply that to explain production, consumption, and deficit and prices of sugar across the period that we've been under these COMESA safeguards. And this will be a very important discussion. And therefore, in our first slide, I hope that you'll be able to remember what the objectives of the COMESA sugar safeguards were, and then be able to remember that even as our presenter will be showing you how that has impacted on, or if we've been able to achieve that across production and actually in productivity, and what's the picture of our deficit and consumption patterns and our prices. And our prices matter because, as we'll see in the conversation, our prices will be compared to global sugar prices, and therefore we will see where we are. And as we said, sugar being a very important ingredient in most foods and even home consumption, then you will be able to see what impact, if there was, of these safeguards on sugar prices. So we'll be able to also demonstrate the sector productivity across the time, because again, that was mostly the need. That's why actually Kenya applied for these sugar safeguards, because we wanted to achieve some things for the sugar sector in the country. Now, the most important part of this discussion, where I'll ask that we are more attentive, will be on the lessons that we draw from this. 24 years is a long time, because in 24 years, we've had five different administrations in our Kenyan leadership. That because we joined this during the Moi regime, and that remained during Kibaki's regime, during Uhuru Kenyatta's regime, and it's just a few months ago that Kenya now exited this arrangement. So what lessons are we drawing from this? Because we want to ask ourselves using the in our analysis, and therefore the evidence that we've generated from this, we want to understand if are we exiting after we've been able to achieve what we wanted to achieve with the safeguards, or what has happened, and therefore what lessons are we learning? And this is not just restricted to the sugar subsector, but to agriculture and the other sectors of the economy as well, because government has a role to play in the different sectors of the economy, and sometimes we have these protectionist policies. So at the end, we'll be able, in the findings that we draw from this, we hope that to put forward strong recommendations that will affect policy processes in other areas of the economy, including the sugar sector. So at the end of this discussion, we hope that we'll be able to understand how our sugar subsector has performed across these years, and whether those protectionist policies under the COMESA safeguards have able to help the country to improve on sugar productivity. And therefore, we hope that you will be part of this discussion to the end. So as I mentioned, we have two presenters who will take us through this. And just two housekeeping rules that I'll put forward. Our cameras and mics will remain on mute until after the presentation, and after that, we'll be able to unmute so that we can engage more. Meanwhile, our chat and Q&A facilities remain open, and therefore you can continue to engage even during the discussion. So, welcome to the discussion, and I hope that it will be enriching, and that we'll be able to engage more on this. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, actually for archival and reference purposes, and we hope that this will be important for future references for all of us and those who not be able to attend at the moment. So without taking more time, I want us to transition to the most interesting part of the discussion, which is the presentation, and I welcome Wachendo to take us through that. Wachendo, you have 20 minutes.
Thanks. So on 30th November 2025, Kenya exited the COMESA sugar industry safeguards. On both sides, there was a lot of praise for the success of both the safeguards and for Kenya having taken advantage of the safeguard. Now, what is a safeguard? It's simply an instrument or a measure that's supposed to give a country the time and the space to get some sector, some subsector, some industry into some specific shape, right? And the idea is that when countries come into an economic integration framework, we've seen this under the World Trade Organization, and we see this also in regional economic communities. One of the customs, one of the traditions is to negotiate for the protection of certain sectors. And one of the premises behind the idea of putting up these barriers is that some sectors are regarded as too infantile to survive the onslaught of competition. So a country will say this industry like Kenya said, Kenya's sugar industry needed to be protected from competition from its COMESA um, countries, its COMESA fellows. COMESA included at the time, it included countries like Zambia, Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, 31, just about 31 countries in total. So COMESA itself followed up a preferential trade area, and it was supposed to be one of the pillars for the economic integration of the African continent. And so that was that was and remains one of the ambitions of this framework. Another ambition is to improve competitiveness, right, of of the African economic community, and then also to serve as a platform for the coordination of policy when the African countries, and in this case, COMESA countries, were interacting with the world and engaging in different fora on trade policy. So it's within this context that Kenya negotiated for the protection of its sugar industry right around the year 2001. So particularly when you fly into Kenya and you look at the sugar industry and you ask where are Kenyans growing sugar? Kenyans are mostly growing sugar in the in the western parts of some specific western regions. Sugar needs a lot of water in order to grow. In economics, you could start with the baseline resources that that region has in terms of water, supply of water, so and the level of wetness in general that you need to grow sugarcane. And then you zoom out a little bit again, and you have what we call the division of labor. There are growers who grow the sugarcane. There are manufacturers who actually purchase the sugar and the sugar cane and turn it into sugar. And then you have retailers who sell the sugar. Kenya argued that all this group of firms needed to be protected from competition from other COMESA countries because they were too weak. And every year, Kenya managed to, because the safeguards are supposed to only last for a year. So every year, Kenya was actually successful in asking for more time to improve the competitiveness of Kenya's sugar industry. Every year, uh, now the specific details about how the competitiveness, how the progress was actually determined are unavailable. But every year the committees, and COMESA would actually release a note and say Kenya has been granted permission to maintain the safeguards for yet another year. And what the safeguards were was that if you wanted to import sugar, there were quotas, there were barriers to the importation of sugar. What you would expect that the Kenyan government to do, right? If they have, you take their argument as of at face value, their objective of improving the competitiveness of the sugar sector, then you would see what economists call um, an intensification of knowledge, more innovation during that time period. It's been more than 23 years, just about 24 years. So every year you would expect that productivity in the production of sugar, of sugarcane and extracting it and making all sorts of products from it, that every year Kenya would be improving based on the argument that the Kenyan government made, that the reason they are taking care of this industry is because, or rather they're guarding this industry, it is infantile. It is a child, it's a baby. It needs to be fed and to grow in strength. Now, This is a screenshot of the national policy on sugar, on the sugar industry, dated April 2001. And here, the objectives that the government set are reiterated. The industry is very important, they claim, so important that more than 5 million Kenyans are relying on the vibrance of this industry, that 100,000 small scale farmers are involved upstream in the production of Kenyan sugarcane, that another 35,000 employees are involved in the manufacture of sugarcane. So, if this is the argument in 2001, then they are claiming that they need time to improve the livelihoods of just about, at minimum, 5 million Kenyans. That these 5 million Kenyans will become wealthier because of the opportunity, the space granted by safeguarding. That in that period, the Kenyans who are living in rural parts of Western Kenya will actually enjoy a lifestyle that is equal to that enjoyed by those in urban areas. So every year, the Kenyan government returned to COMESA, and it is a matter of curiosity, in fact, that they were so successful year on year in making this argument. The final point is that because of the preeminence of the crop in that region of Kenya, it gained not only a sociocultural weight, but when you look at the evolution of Kenya's political economy, for example, the patrimonialism that has become a character of Kenyan politics, and then the evolution that has also involved a devolved government. We went from a very centralized government to a devolved government. But in that period, the sugarcane continued to be a very important part of the political culture of that region and an important determinant of the direction of politics. Now, it need not have been. Ideally, the leadership should have taken a position, right, implied by their desire to improve competitiveness, that measures to continuously improve the competitiveness of this sector would take priority over any other political expediencies. Moses?
Right. Thanks, Emmanuel. So allow me to try and track back and then marry to what I'm about to say. So as Jaira stated at the very beginning, that society needs to move towards prosperity. And at individual level, prosperity might mean succeeding in whatever ventures you want. For that to be achieved, an environment has to be created. And this is on government level, whereby everybody has a chance at it. Now, based on that desire, which is the benchmark or the North Star that directs what the Institute of Economic Affairs does, now we have to check this particular concern since Kenya joined COMESA, while COMESA was constituted in the first place, all the way to Kenya applying for safeguard on their sugar industry, and what has been the result. So on the analysis part, we intend to answer three things. So over the period since 2001 to today, how has the sector been behaving? And then from that, based on the policy Kenya adopted in regard to that specific industry, is there a connection between the policy itself and the results is there a divergence? And what does that mean to us? So one of the reasons that this is an important subject is the national food policy that was created in 2001 had very specific objective. One of them being that Kenya should have self-sufficiency in food, should have food security, it should create jobs, generate incomes based on the policy, the food policy. That domestic policy influenced what Kenya asked from COMESA on an international level now, because they felt one of the priority area in the food policy was sugar. And since Kenyan industry would have been outcompeted by their counterparts from the COMESA, they needed to be protected for a while. It was initially for 1 year, so that they are able to restructure and be at a point where they can actually compete with their counterpart from COMESA. So we are going to track and see, did Kenya actually achieve that? If it did, what does that tell us about policy? But more importantly, if you're looking this from the end of a policymaker, you're asking yourself, did this policy, which have survived for more than 20 years, bring the results or the objectives that were supposed to be achieved? On a citizen side, you need to realize sugar being a key component of a Kenyan household is affected by the policy, and therefore some of the costs we incur on an individual or household level are directly linked to this policy. So when Kenya applied for the safeguard from COMESA, and as Emmanuel put it, this safeguard was to allow the Kenyan sugar industry to restructure, to develop its infrastructure, to invest in productivity improvement, and then with that condition achieved, then Kenya's sugar industry would be able to compete. Given, remember, COMESA has a free trade agreement whereby Kenya should not prevent any member of COMESA from selling things to Kenyans, and therefore it would mean Kenya could import sugar from whichever member of COMESA with no restriction, both tariff and non-tariff. But the safeguard allowed Kenya to place a tariff quota rate. What that means is that Kenya would only allow importation of sugar into Kenya of a certain quota without tariffing, without asking them to pay tariffs. But beyond that quota, now the imports would be slapped with tariffs so that to protect the Kenyan industry from this competition. So the reason why the industry needed to be protected from the competition is because Kenya felt if there was open competition, imported sugar would be way cheaper than the Kenyan sugar. And as we all know, people would prefer to buy what is more affordable, well, based on their preference and assuming which, in this case, we assume that sugar is of standard quality, that if you go to the market to buy sugar and all sugar is of the same quality and you have no preference buyers, then you'll go for the cheapest. And given that some COMESA countries were able to produce their sugar at a lower cost, it means also their retail prices would be lower. Unless Kenyan policy intervened to prevent that to happen, which the safeguard allowed Kenya to do. So if you move to the next slide. So what methods did we employ to analyze this? So we created index both on the production level, consumption level, and deficit, and also asked ourselves, how has sugar prices behavior been for the last 2 decades? So this is in a desire to match. Remember, the objective of the safeguard was to improve productivity, and productivity here means the amount of output we could get from the factors of production that we employed in the sugar sector. So using a multi-factor productivity, we are going to test what is the farm level of productivity. How much sugarcane do Kenyan farms produce? And how much sugar comes from whatever sugarcane is taken to factories in Kenya? And as a whole, what is the productivity of this industry? Next slide, please. So on a productive level, since 2005, and this is based on the available data, as you can see from this index, that around 205, which is our base year, and therefore we are 205 is 100. So the index at 205 is 100. It's our base year. What it shows you is since 205 to present, production in sugar has grown by 1.6 times. So remember, the amount of sugar we are producing, given the factors of production we are employing, determines how productive we are, which we will calculate at, we will show at some point. But this is important to note because if over this same period that we wanted to improve our productivity, we did not even double our production. And remember, more land was put into use, more people were probably employed. So over the years, we have almost stagnated when it comes to sugar production. It's important to remember, if you read the food policy that was written in 2001, it says that 5,000 people were employed in the sugar industry. That is by 1999. If you check the current data from KNBS, that's the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, you realize that the sugar industry, those people who are directly employed to do manufacturing of sugar, it's about 13,000. And those who are employed in growing of sugarcane are about 32,000. So these numbers tell you, as far as the objective of creation of employment is concerned, the industry over 2 decades did not have a very substantial improvement. And given that we cannot quantify whether these 35,000 were people in the sugar manufacturing, because if it is, then it means the employment numbers have been falling over time to present. And one of the indicators of this could be maybe the industry moved towards more capital-intensive production, or the production was too small that they didn't need so many people to do it, or individuals improved their productivity. But all in all, we can tell that the sugar production in the country did not substantially increase. Now, when we match, and we'll see this in the next slide, we ask ourselves, how much sugar did Kenyan consume within the same period of time? If we move to the next slide. So, using the same method to measure how much sugar was consumed over the same period of time, what you can see that sugar consumption in Kenya grew at a faster rate than sugar production in the country. And because sugar consumption almost doubled, and remember, sugar production grew by 1.6 over the period. So why did consumption increase in this case? It's important to note that Kenyans are among the highest consumers of sugar in Africa. Well, we are the largest consumer in Africa, with individual consumption being about 400 grams per week. And what that tells you is Kenya have a preference for sugar. And since they have a preference for sugar, then the consumption keeps growing. Now, this is even made more intense to the fact that for the last 1 decade, Kenyan population has been growing by 2%. So if the preference for sugar remains the same, it means the demand for sugar will keep growing at this rate or a faster one over time. And the biggest question to ask ourselves is, with the production numbers as they are, are we able to meet this sugar demand? Because remember, if the demand dominates supply, then the prices will definitely shoot. And remember, there are two alternatives of how Kenyans get their sugar. We either produce the sugar or we buy from others. But within the safeguard, and which have been in application for the last 24 years, the importation of sugar was, barriers were placed against that. In essence, it doesn't mean necessarily that sugar importation was banned, but at some point it was. But it means that more restriction, which increased the cost of importing sugar in Kenya, were placed, and therefore imported sugar also became expensive. But now, if we go to the next slide and compare the prices of the deficit of sugar that has been over time, and this deficit is the difference between what we produce and what people consume. So as you can see, over this same period of time, the deficit in sugar has grown more than thrice. So remember, production has almost stagnated. In 24 years, it has only grown by 1.6 times. Production has almost, consumption has almost doubled over the same period, and the deficit has been growing at a very rampant pace compared to the production. So what does this tell you? That the required sugar from importation has kept growing over time. So based on the fact that we applied for the safeguard in order to ensure that the sugar industry in the country is able to be outward looking, and this will mean that we are not only able to produce sugar for domestic consumption, but we are able to produce sugar that can compete and be sold within the COMESA and also globally. First of all, we cannot produce enough sugar just to meet the local demand. That's one of what this data is showing. And it shows that this is becoming worse with time, that the deficit is growing so fast over time. And therefore, the situation is worsening. So we are way worse than we were when the safeguard started. And what explains this could be, how has the productivity of the sugar sector played within this same period? And we need to ask ourselves, did the conditions that Kenya promised to take to make the sector productive or more productive than it was in 2001 work? And if it did or did not, what does this mean? So on the next slide, now this is the consequence. Now, before we go to checking on whether the productivity worked or not, we ask ourselves, how much have Kenyans been paying for their sugar? Now, remember this, the Kenyan government made a food policy. So that is the level of policy making. This policy influenced how Kenya behaved towards the international community, and in this case, COMESA. And therefore, the policy directed the Kenyan government to apply for a safeguard for the sugar industry. But now, how does this translate to us as citizens, or to you as an individual, or to your household? So most of this is transmitted to us in two ways, but one of the most critical one is in the prices. So as you can see, the global average price of sugar per kg, and please do note that this data is not seasonally adjusted, that in 2005, sugar prices were around 42 shilling per kg on average globally. There were more than 50 bob or 50 shillings, Kenyan shillings in this case, in Kenya. And over time, Kenyans have been paying more for their sugar per unit than the global average shows. So if you come to the latest data that is in 2024, Kenyan sugar on average, please, the keyword here is on average because it could mean that there's some of the sugar which is more expensive than the average, and of course there are those that are cheaper. But a kg of sugar as of 2024 was at 171 shillings, but globally it was just around 50 to 60 shillings. So what that shows you is that Kenyans pay about triple the amount that anybody else in the world on average pays for. So how should that be interpreted? We have a high demand for sugar. Remember, data shows that Kenyans have a very high preference for sugar. We have an almost stagnant production of sugar, and then we exist in a framework that limits importation of sugar in the country, and therefore there are so many barriers against that. And of course, now the market then interprets that information and the prices shoot. So it's important to ask yourself, for a country as determined in 2022 that has a poverty rate of almost 40%, with meaning that 40% of the individuals in the country are living below the poverty line, whether a government should focus on protecting through safeguards as it has done over time, the sugar industry, then causing Kenyans to pay more for their sugar than anybody else in the world is doing, whether that is a justifiable case to be done. And by asking that question, what we are asking here is, was this a worthwhile trade-off? Now, remember when we talked about production, we showed the number of people employed under the industry. And we are asking ourselves, one of the arguments, and this happened a lot in Kenya, for protecting particular industry is to ensure that people still get jobs. But as the number was showing, compared to 1999, which as reported in the National Food Policy, the sugar industry employed 35,000 people. It employed about 100,000 farmers, small-scale farmers in this case. But in 2024, these numbers look lower. And therefore, the argument that we are protecting the industry to create employment is being disputed by this evidence. But even with that being disputed, then we are asking ourselves, is it justifiable for Kenyans to pay a higher cost for sugar because the industry is being protected? That's number one. The industry is not creating as many jobs. And of course, if it's not creating, also data shows that the incomes have not substantially grown. Therefore, it's also not generating as much income. Remember, the food policy had an objective of achieving self-sufficiency, which means that we are able to produce enough ourselves. As you can see, the deficit, as we showed in the previous slides, has outpaced production at a very, very high rate. So it's almost at 4 times because it has grown by 3.7 times over the same period of time. So we have a high deficit, which is growing. We have fewer people employed. We have lower incomes still on the same sector. And then Kenyans are having to part with so much money to buy sugar. And this is a key component of a Kenyan household. So that is what the evidence shows. So how has the industry performed over time? Next slide, please. So if we check the land under which sugarcane is grown, remember sugar can be produced from cane or it can be produced from beet. In Africa, Egypt produces sugar both from cane and beet, but in Kenya, it's purely beet. So if we check the land under which we have sugar cane, and as Emmanuel stated, sugar cane in Kenya is predominantly grown in western region, in around 10 counties which dominate that. So if we take the total tons of cane produced over the years, and then ask ourselves what land size we harvested, we realize that Kenya farms or land yield around 40 to 60 tons per hectare. Now, this has remained the same for over 2 decades. Remember, part of the reason why we wanted the safeguard is to improve our productivity, which in essence would trickle down, meaning that we'll become more competitive within the COMESA. But over the last 2 decades, Kenyan farms have yielded almost the same tons of cane per hectare, which is about 40 to 60. The reason why there's a huge discrepancy in these averages is because one of the characteristics of production of sugarcane in Kenya is that the land, some are very small scale, and therefore they are constrained in their production, and then we have medium-sized production. But if you check the global numbers, which is around 70 to 80 tons of sugarcane per hectare, and COMESA's average are even higher than that, with countries such as Zambia producing around 112 tons per hectare, which is almost triple what some of the Kenyan land produce. So what this tells you is to produce the same amount of, or to have the same yield as the global average, Kenya needs double, to double this effort. Under the safeguard, which we have said have existed since to November 2025, this has barely changed. So in terms of farm level productivity, the claim that we needed safeguard to improve this productivity, it did not bear the fruits. Now, this necessarily cannot be blamed on the safeguards themselves, but what was done during the safeguard period. So on the next slide, we check at a farm level and ask ourselves, for all cane that was delivered to a factory, how much sugar was produced? So on average globally, when a ton of cane is manufactured into sugar, it produces around 100 kg of sugar. So that is 10% sugar recovery from cane. On the Kenyan end, and this is for the last 5 years, it has remained at 9%, which is not far off from the global average. What this tells you is that the factories that manufacture sugar in Kenya, irrespective of the size, are almost matching the global manufacturing standard. However, it's important to note that it's still lower than that. So not only are we producing fewer sugarcane from our land than the global averages and COMESA, we also recovering sugar from this cane at a lower rate than the global average. So we are behind in terms of using the same size of lands, but getting almost half what others are getting. And also our factories are also producing at least a percentage to 3% less than of sugar, using the same amount of cane as any other factory elsewhere globally. So in both cases, what it shows you, we have not yet matched those that we desired match within the safeguard period in order we can compete with them. So how has the industry as a whole performed over this same period? Next slide, please. So on the overall sugar productivity, you realize that Kenyan's sugar industry produces about 3.6 to 5.6 tons of sugar per hectare. On a global average level, or let's take COMESA in this case, it produces almost triple and double of that. So it produces about 8 to 11 tons per hectare. So the productivity of the sugar industry in Kenya is still way too low compared to COMESA. So despite the fact that we applied and consistently convinced the COMESA Council that we deserve to have these safeguards because we were working on making the industry more productive, evidence shows that whatever was done was not sufficient enough to do that. Now, some of the explainers of this is, remember, sugarcane needs to be grown on land. It needs some specific condition under which it should grow. And also, innovation is needed to make this industry work. So when we look into the fact that land is fixed, and this is a point opposing the fact that there was a desire in 2001 to be self-sufficient in food production in the country. We have a fixed amount of land. We are heavily dependent on the weather because we have not adopted other mechanisms to ensure we have water and all that. And those constraints tells you that irrespective of any other mechanism we take, we are constrained on those fixed resources. And that is out of our control. But more so is, under this protective regime in the sugar industry, the industry, especially on cane production, has refused to grow and to innovate in terms of the type of cane they grow, because on average, cane takes 18 to 24 months from planting to harvesting in Kenya. Some of the best producing countries in the COMESA take 9 to 12 months from planting to harvesting their cane. What that tells you is they take half the time Kenyan farmers take waiting. And one other interesting factor is, over this period, the area under cane and the area harvested, only 40% on average is harvested. So for example, we have 250,000 hectares of land under cane, only 40% of that is harvested annually. So what that tells you is, one, of course, is the discrepancy in when the planting happened, but it also shows you the fact that we take too much time before maturity and harvest. It's costing us a lot because it implies that 60% of the land under cane does not yield over the years. And therefore, we can confidently say that irrespective of the safeguard and some of the mechanisms that have been taken over time, that the sugar industry productivity is almost at the same level as it was in 2001. And what question we would be asking ourselves here is, with this implication, it means that the safeguards were used not in a way to improve the productivity, but to generate something else, which we'll discuss on some of the lessons we draw from this. But given this low productivity, it translates that Kenyans have to pay a lot more. That is 3 times as of 2024 on what any other person or the global average pays for sugar. So Kenya is not the most developed country in the world. We all know that. We are actually quite far behind from the global leaders in terms of prosperity, and this is just by measuring GDP per capita. But we also have a very high preference for sugar, but we also pay the highest cost for sugar. This is how policy made by policymakers, and this is the people we elect, maybe our MPs, our MCAs, and anybody else who has a mandate to make policy in the country. These people are elected by citizens, and therefore, as a citizen, you're asking yourself, do I deserve to pay this much money for my sugar? Because we are protecting a specific industry. And over 2 decades, this industry has not improved. What lesson do we draw from this? But before we draw this lesson, allow me to invite Emmanuel to make a few presentations. Thanks.
Thank you, Moses. So to take us back to the very argument that the government made and to contrast that with what empirically produces a flourishing society, right? A wealthier society. So under economic orthodoxy, the government's job is, and the government's duty to households and firms is to maximize household and firm welfare. Whenever safeguards are suggested, the effect of safeguards is actually to maximize, or rather to tip the scale of welfare in favor of the firm and against the household in 2 ways. Because in the first place, in order for the government to engage in protecting the firm or depending on the specific measures, right? The government must expend resources. These resources are raised from taxes because taxes must necessarily destroy some surplus. If in this case, a household and firm surplus, because that's where the taxes are being collected from, then what we're interested in seeing is an offset of that destroyed surplus in the form of public goods. So in this case, the government says that they want these safeguards in order to develop infrastructure. That's an example of a public good that the government claimed that they wanted to have the space to develop. But when we look at the resultant productivity levels, and we try to assess as much as we can how much household and firm welfare actually improved over this period, we can see that firm welfare in terms of productivity did not improve, but maybe when measured in terms of other forms of incentives, the fact that these firms continue to engage in this sector means that they benefited, but they didn't benefit in a way that they benefited at the expense of the households. Now, the second way they benefited at the expense of the households was in terms of the prices that households then had to purchase for sugar. Ideally, we should have seen increased specialization over that period. We should have seen the market for sugar expanding, which we did not. We should have seen improved relatedness, which is to say that growers, sugar manufacturers, and retailers would have, as specialization improved, we should have seen then households, we should have seen more and more uses for sugar as an intermediate good in the production of other final goods. We should have seen an increase in the intensity of innovation, right, which would have contributed to more and more specialization. We should have seen improved efficiency and a comparative advantage that evolved to a level to at least compete with Zambia and the other COMESA sugar producers. Now, the slide before us shows us Kenyan exports of sugar confectionaries. Now, sugar confectionery, how to understand this? This is like candy. Sugar confectionery represents a value addition on sugar. So you took sugar intermediates and produced something besides just sugar. We exported 24 million in sugar confectionaries to Africa, or rather, yeah, actually to the whole world. We mainly, or Kenyan firms mainly exported these sugar confectionaries to Africa and principally to the East African community, to the nations of the East African community, and then COMESA. You have 18.2% of that 24 million going to Malawi, and you have 26% actually going to Uganda and 18 to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Chart 6 shows us and allows us to compare Kenyan exports of sugar confectionaries to the market for sugar confectionaries around the world. So the African market for sugar confectionaries was just about 263 million, which is to say that African countries put together exported 263 million of the world's sugar confectionery, which means Kenya was not so poorly placed on the African continent. Now, globally, the African continent, the market for sugar confectionaries was valued at 15.6 billion. So this gives us an idea of what the value of markets that Kenyan firms could have been able to exploit if in that 24-year period productivity improved. So we're sitting at 24.4 million with productivity in sugar itself being very low, and then our deficit in terms of our the market demand for sugar being very large. But this is not the end of what one can actually do with sugar. You could actually go further, a step above confectionery products in terms of economic complexity. That is to say, how much knowledge you put into producing something out of sugar, which is just another way to state the idea of improving productivity. So if you improve productivity again, you could actually produce sugar alcohols. So alcohol actually involves sugar in its production. So alcoholic products like wine, I think there's something called kombucha that people enjoy. All these are products that come out of sugar. Also have fermentation products like ethanol, organic acids that could also be produced out of sugar. You also have high value biochemicals. So beyond the market for sugar confectionaries, there is still yet more that the production that sugar can play as an intermediate product of. Now we zoom further out and we ask ourselves the question of what kind of political economy actually produces the highest levels of welfare. empirically, classical liberal institutions, that is, if you have a country with free markets, which is the opposite of safeguarding, if you have a country with limited government, right? Kenya's government is about 30% of Kenya's GDP, so it's very, very large. It's weighty. If you have efficient regulations, this presentation has actually been a showcase in inefficient regulations, because the regulations that they sought in the form of safeguards and then whatever else, other arrangements that the government sought within the sugar industry did not actually produce, did not actually result in a competitive sector. So the regulations, you could infer, were inefficient. The fact that firms, Kenyan firms, as represented by their whatever the umbrella organization for the sugar industry was, would meet with the government to actually agree on prices, goes against the principle of free markets. And then finally, the rule of law is the final important plank in creating a prosperous society. So the Kenyan sugar industry wasn't subjected to competition as it should have been. Now we move to our lessons on policy. Moses?
With all the underlying evidence and all the objective of government in terms of food and specifically on sugar industry, one of the things that this tells us is the conditions or the behavior in terms that was taken in regards to the safeguard after we were allowed to have them did not improve productivity. Instead, it eroded consumer welfare because we had to pay higher prices for sugar. Well, it also created rents for people who now had the opportunity to charge higher prices. Remember, importation of sugar should have led to the drop in prices because a convergence would have happened and prices should have fallen. But since there was this protectionist safeguard that was put in place, it means over the 2 decades, this led to higher prices for sugar, which necessarily should not have been the case. And given this case, what Emmanuel has illustrated is, instead of being obsessed in growing sugarcane, manufacturing sugar as a country, there are other things maybe Kenya is best placed to do in regard to the sugar industry. Other things that would create benefit and create higher incomes for Kenyans, in the sense that if the government allowed free importation of sugar, both industrial and commercial, and more value was created or added to it, and then exported to different parts of the world, as Emmanuel showed, Kenyans would have a better chance at generating more incomes than they have with protecting their sugar industry. Remember, when there is competition, 2 things are likely to happen. So when competition happens, of course, those within the playing field will either be pushed out if they cannot compete with the others, or they will be forced to innovate and become productive so that they can compete with each other. But competition optimizes consumers' welfare or consumer surplus, and therefore prices will be relatively lower than in an environment where there is no competition. But more important is to realize that if a sector is not competitive enough, especially against global leaders, given that Kenya is a small open economy, it's an indicator of constraints or the strains in our productivity of production. And in an open market, when resources have a very high opportunity cost producing one thing, they are mostly moved to a more productive sector. And remember, under these safeguards, a lot of bailing out had to happen. The most significant one, I think, as you could have seen from the data in 2007, there was a significant fall in production, about 50% fall. And therefore, government had to come in and bail out the losses that were incurred, both to the farmers, to the factories and all that, amounting to almost 117 billion. So if you check that amount of money, and let's ask ourselves what matters most to Kenyans. So think education, health. If you equate that amount of money to maybe secondary school budget per year, or how much health infrastructure that would have constructed, the trade-off is too high. But even more, what competition allows, it allows creative distraction. And by creative distraction means that if a certain sector is not productive enough, and with time it's competed from the market, that distraction pushes those resources to be used in a different way. With these lessons, what we need to notice here is, with Kenya exiting the safeguard, if Kenya adopts the free trade agreement with COMESA, which they signed to adopt, and of course Kenya is a member of WTO, and they allow free importation of sugar in the country, two scenarios are likely to play out. Number one is the sugar industry in Kenya will innovate and become more productive so that they can compete, or it's going to be out-competed. Already the existing strain, especially those linked to land, weather, shows that there's little that can be done on that front. Well, we can go to the irrigation production mechanism, but again, one of the dynamics of the sugarcane production in Kenya is small scale. Small scale farmers have very high trade-off if they were to adopt irrigation, and therefore that would be too expensive. So those trends shows you that there's a high likelihood that they will be outcompeted. So if that happens, it means it's the responsibility of government, instead of protecting the sector and allowing inefficiency to exist, in order to allow labor and production mobility, government need to shield them for a while. And given that government has been setting money to bail them out, if, let's say, sugarcane farming is outcompeted and the sugarcane farmers will have to move on to a different thing, it's government to set up a program where they assure these people between the transition period, they have income, which can be easily done through transfer payments, and government can easily map which people are doing what. But also government should set up mechanism to retrain these people to move to whatever production line they would want to. And especially because there's a higher value sugar industry production that can happen, that can be dependent on importation of the raw materials. So if government allow importation of both industrial and commercial sugar, which Kenyans can add more value to it and export, then that would be the best case scenario. But these lessons are important. Why? Because like we said, sugar production in Kenya is very regional because it's on the western side. It's good to be awake to the political nature of that, given that also the western side also happen to be among the most, let's say, has a high number of electorates in the place, meaning that they have high political power due to votes. And protecting the industry could sound as if it's protecting the welfare of the Western people. But as we can see, it's not creating more jobs. It's not creating better incomes. but there are opportunities for that to be achieved. But for that to be achieved, then the market need to be opened. And then this production line might be outcompeted. And therefore, that's why we think that government should have a program to ensure that that mobility happen without so much friction. If you are a leader in the region or in the country and thinking about that, first of all, we are all aware that that political power will be used in one way or another by the citizens to claim protection against erosion of their welfare. And we feel the best way to do that is to allow, if the industry is to fall because of competition, we allow it to, but we should not abandon the people to suffer because that is unjustifiable and unfair, but have a program where income transfer for a specified period of time, the training and allowing transition to different production happen. And these are important lessons because, again, even as citizens, we also need to be aware that sometimes demanding to be protected and in this level, farm level protection does not improve our welfare, and it probably improves the welfare of other people. And therefore, it's not working for us. But there are other alternatives of how welfare can be protected in the short run, allowing us to move in more productive areas. So, what do we recommend to policymakers as far as productivity comes in? So next slide. So remember, if we open our market to competition, so that this competition is market-led, it means that it will push us to be more efficient because of competition and because of the desire not to be kicked out of the market. And it also pushed some of the production to move to more productive ventures and abandon those that are not, which is a characteristic of decent economies. Point example, one of the leading sectors in the country is the textile industry, which is outward looking, meaning that we produce to export to the US. It's important to note some centuries ago, the US was producing clothes by themselves. But due to competition and realizing more productive ventures they could do, they allowed mobility to higher level production, allowing other parts of the world to produce the clothes and they could buy from them. Kenyan policy framework should adopt a similar approach. And we can clearly say, and it's evident that the US citizens have a better welfare than us if we look at GDP per capita. And if Kenya is to achieve better welfare, then we actually need to start adapting to things that can improve efficiency as far as production is concerned. But like I said earlier, as this happens, some people will be made worse off. And in this case, having expiring transfer and supporting labor mobility either through retraining, which can be a short-term retraining, is important. So if government realize that importing sugar makes some constituents lose their job, the best thing government can do is income protect those people for a while through transferring the incomes to them, which will not be as expensive as the bailout that happened in the Kenyan government when some sector are dragging behind, like the sugar sector has been over the years. And then as this transfer of income is happening, it frees these people to be retrained and to be shown other opportunities that they can actually, or even allow them to identify the opportunity they would want to pursue and government helping in that transition. It's important that also we realize that innovation is among the key tools that is likely to improve our productive capacity, and government should support that. One of the things that is highly missing in this country is support for research. Like we pointed earlier, Kenya plants cane that takes almost 2 years to mature. The world uses half that time. This can only be achieved if research is heavily supported, which has basically, and therefore policymakers in this country should think about that. And it's high time, and Kenya of late has been wanting to move to be a Singapore, but whether that's achievable or not is out of the scope of this meeting. But one of the best international trade policy to adopt is a free unilateral policy whereby Kenya adopt an open market against the world with some benchmark. And the Trade and Development Program at the Institute of Economic Affairs is working to develop such a policy. So hopefully we can be able to do that, and the policymakers in the country will adopt it. But given this recommendation we have to policymakers, the citizens have a role to play to make it work. So I'll invite Emmanuel to tell us what do we recommend that the citizen should think or take about. Thanks.
Thanks, Moses. So on the citizen side, the first is, these differentials that we demonstrated are actually effectively an insult to the citizen. Why? Because the citizen is being forced to pay twice. On the one hand, he pays the taxes. In that period, in that 24-year period, actually the poverty headcount dropped and then rose again, right? It was resurrected, and a type of resurrection that is undesirable. We saw that in the current state, in the current year, more than 40% of Kenyans are actually living below the poverty line. Not only are they living below the poverty line, they're spending more than 50% of their income on food. Now, as they spend 50% of their income on food, they're paying almost 4 times more for their sugar than the global average. And they're paying 4 times for their sugar than the global average, not because they live in a faraway island and there's no shipment of sugar, and the only shipment of sugar there is by one lowly transporter who must then charge very high prices for that sugar, or because they live on the moon, but because their own government has effectively placed them under a sugar blockade. And so they are incurring significant cost that can be avoided. Now, on the side that where the citizens are actually households that are directly involved in the trade of sugar, there should be some questions about the policy tendency to pick winners or protectionism, because they too are holding the purse. But because countries like Kenya, or rather Kenya specifically, is actually erring towards protectionism again and again, towards the muscular policy responses that oversimplify complex problems, well, they have to ask whether it is actually a sustainable way to continue living, where every election cycle, tough choices have to be made, and so many industries are potentially on the chopping block, and then each one has to lobby for bailouts, which one would imagine is a stressful environment which to live. Now, why should the sugar sector be any more special than on any other sector? Why shouldn't we protect journalists in the same way? Why shouldn't we protect pastoralists or people such as myself making all these webinars? Perhaps I too would wake up tomorrow and ask that the government will protect me. Now, in such a state of affairs, we wouldn't have enough resources to protect everyone. But a transition must be envisioned, just as my colleague Moses explained, so that beyond the sugar industry, difficult political confrontations and painful restructuring actually await. Now, poor dysfunctional protectionist arrangements are a breeding ground for populism. Populism is an unwieldy phenomenon that can actually result in that can hurt anyone, people caught by strays, sorry. So how? For example, when you have an array of protectionist arrangements like we do in Kenya, and then inevitably a government must actually uh, reorganize its public affairs and its budgets, and we need to have adult conversations. It's often the case that, okay, on the one, the adult conversations could be overshadowed by populism because in the face of disaster, right? In the face of a situation where we might lose our protections, we as households and firms of a specific sector, and the anxiety that comes with with losing uh, these protectionist arrangements, when demagogues emerge and promise easy solutions to these complex problems, it's very easy for us to be swayed by them again, only to wake up to having been lied to. And that, so it's not a way to build a nation. In other words, more protectionism means more pain when the levee breaks. This is what I'm trying to make clear. In the end, this was yet another case where the government took a muscular approach using words like we shall protect, safeguard, words that sound good. You know, it's a good thing to be protected. Who would argue against being safeguarded? But we must go further and ask who is actually being safeguarded. In the case of market protections, it is just usually the firms, and the firms are being protected at the expense of the households. This is a question both for the sugar industry, but for the Kenyan polity as a whole. Can we have the courage to confront these difficult questions, navigate in such a way that where there is pain, the pain is minimized, confront the issue before reality snaps and forces us to confront the issue in the period of a crisis? Thank you. Oh, pardon me. Let me actually, in the end, I explained it in a sort of a scattershot fashion, but what citizens actually need to do is demand resolution of disequilibria beyond the sugar industry. So have placing some faith in the forces of creative destruction. Seek the retraction of protections. Negotiate for public funds for cushioning in that period and for cushioning specifically for households, not for firms. Allow for firms to be destroyed by the forces of the market, to be exposed by the market, and to be forced to either compete, restructure, or to fade away. This should be repeated sector by sector. Why? We've demonstrated the relationship between knowledge intensity, innovation, productivity, and overall welfare. and that this welfare that we seek to be like the wealthiest countries in the world. That level of welfare was arrived at not through protectionism, and definitely not through a protectionism that didn't even deliver on the little that it promised. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emmanuel and Moses, for your presentations. Now, in the interest of time, I'll not rehash through that. But what has been demonstrated very clearly is that the objectives that the government had when applying for these safeguards in 2001 and sustaining that for another 24 years, as most of them actually have not been achieved. And one of them that stood out very clearly was on sufficiency. And Moses has demonstrated that our consumption still outpaces our production. He has demonstrated our inefficiencies in production. And the most painful one was the one on price, that these safeguards have just made it, has made sugar more expensive for Kenyans who are not as rich, because with a 40% population living below the poverty line and paying 3 times for the global price of sugar, then that's so bad for the welfare. And then they've taken us through the lessons, and just to mention two that will be very key, that was what actually I've just mentioned earlier on the erosion of consumer welfare arising from higher prices, and how competition has restricted or just made it difficult for the sugar subsector to innovate and become competitive. And he also gave a scenario of actually what will happen, or what needs to happen if what will happen if Kenya now opens up the sugar for the Kenyan sector for competition, and that is either to innovate and increase productivity, or be outcompeted, and then the sector transitions into other more productive sectors. And then Emmanuel has summed up that with other recommendations for citizens and for policymakers. Now, I'll have to give an opportunity to people who want to ask questions, and I think now your microphones have been enabled. So if you raise your hand, I'll be able to pick you up, and then you can speak out your question. And I'll start with those who want to voice their questions. You can raise your hand. As I wait for that, I have several questions in our Q&A section. And the good thing is that I hope our presenters have seen these and prepared responses. Now, I'll start with Alex Odhiambo, who asks that data shows that Kenya actually depends more on sugar imports. How can we, then he asks, how can we make Kenya to be a world leader in sugar production? How can we enhance sugar production in Kenya? I think Moses and Emmanuel, you should be able to respond to that. Fiona Okadia, a colleague here, has asked 3 questions, which I'll sum them. I'll just read them once. And I think as much as you've covered this, it will be important to say it again. So she asks, what were the unintended consequences from the prolonged protection? And actually, 24 years is a very long time if 10 years into this already, there was evidence that this was not achieving the outcomes. Then why did we have to wait for 24 years to exit? So our question is, what were the unintended consequences of this prolonged protectionism? And then another question that is on who actually benefited from these safeguards. Was it the farmers? Was it the millers or the government? And lastly, she makes a comment that clearly, I think she concludes now from your presentation that clearly safeguards did not improve productivity, and therefore she asks, what then should be done differently? And lastly, we have Vivian Ochola. Who is asking, do Kenyans have hope for sugar prices reduction after exiting the COMESA safeguards? You're paying 3 times the world prices of sugar. And now that we have exited, we are moving away from the safeguards that actually made this worse. Do we have some hope for lower sugar prices? Over to you, Emmanuel, and I'll start with Moses and then Emmanuel. Please be precise because of the interest of time. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Gareth. Well, 5 questions here to tackle. So, well, how do we make Kenya a global leader in sugar production? Like I said, what we are calling for here is to allow competition to happen. And one of the things that this competition might prove to Kenya, it's not best suited to be a sugar producer for the world. If you compare the best producers of sugar in Africa, which is probably Zambia, they are highly irrigation. There's high irrigation in their production mechanism. They have certain advantages that Kenya might lack. It's important to notice that Kenya barely uses irrigation, if any, and it's 80% arid and semi-arid. So we have less water on the ground. We have a fixed amount of land. We don't have the blessing of Zambezi like Zambia would have. So irrigation might be more expensive for Kenya than it is for Zambia. Our desire is to Kenya to go to what works, which the market can easily direct it to, rather than government or a few people deciding that we need to keep a certain sector moving. And that's why Emmanuel illustrated that maybe there are other things that anybody wanting to deal with the sugar industry or to deal with that production line should focus in. And this could be maybe importing the raw materials for sugar and converting them to a higher value item and then selling it to the world. And maybe that's a better alternative, because at the end of the day, remember, is that we want a prosperous society. And therefore, going for what works is way better than forcing something that is not working to work. So what was the unintended consequence of the safeguard? First of all, there is a justifiable reason why safeguards exist, and we've seen countries that have used the WTO safeguarding to make something work. But 4 years into it, the Kenyan government should have noticed that it's not working, and they should have exited as early as 2004, 2005 or thereabout, but they didn't. So one of the unintended consequences is the pricing. Sugar prices are very high, meaning that Kenyans have to suffer the trade-offs of paying for the costly sugar. The other consequence was the amount of billions of money, and well, people would want to call them government money, but we are all aware that anything called government money is either tax or debt, and therefore it's citizens' money that government holds on their behalf. We're used to bail out the millers, to pay losses, to give factories money to pay farmers for their gain. So there's that, and that was has very high trade-offs. And one of some these consequences are not only expensive in terms of money, they also degraded, eroded welfare. Remember, the sector did not create more jobs as claimed. It did not improve income for these people. So in some way, it's one of the leading causes of the western region of Kenya, which is dominantly which dominates in this sugar production or sugarcane production in this case, to be left behind or not necessarily to achieve income level that they should have achieved. So who benefited from the safeguard? Well, partly some of the policymakers benefited because remember, these safeguards are portrayed in society, and this is something we want everybody to understand. When government claims they are protecting an industry, it's not equivalent to when government says they are protecting the welfare of its citizen. Because people think it's the same thing. And so those who tend to benefit from such a system are those who are able to maximize on collecting the rents. So in this case, think of people who were able to import cheaper sugar under the license that were given for importation and then sell it at the same price level that Kenyan sugar was going at. So they make a kill of that. And think of people who are shielded from the cost of making themselves efficient, that they could continue to exist, whether it's factories, whether it's sugarcane farmers, they could continue existing without paying the cost of becoming more productive. So what next? First of all, it is our stand that exiting the COMESA sugar safeguard is a good move. And it should have come way earlier than it did. So that we support. What should happen next is that the Kenyan government should allow free importation of sugar into the country. And that will answer Vivian's question. If that is allowed, then the prices of sugar in Kenya might converge with the global average price. Therefore, meaning sugar might become cheaper for Kenyans, which is a good thing. But I must emphasize that we recognize that given that sugar industry is almost regional in the country, and it is from a region that has high political power. And of course, these are people living in this area. This disruption might cause some people's income to be eroded or to be lost totally. And therefore, these people need to be supported to transition. And we feel that government having a transfer payment of a limited time span specifically communicated if this plays out the way we think it could play out. Government should transfer incomes to these people for a particular time, and also they should support any transition and any labor mobility in this case. Thank you very much.
Emmanuel, you want to add something?
Thanks. Thanks. So there was a question about whether making Kenya world sugar production. So first of all, this is the way that trade policy is usually formulated in Kenyan minds and in Kenyan policy discourse, right? In general, we have protectionism as an absolute, and then dominance as an absolute, right? That those are the positions that most of us have in trade policy, and we want Kenya to be strong, which is another position that we take in what we propose. But then when we look at trade, there are many counter intuitions. So starting off with this, you cannot be the best at every single thing there is to produce in the market. The second point is many countries, for example, on this continent, Kenya and Egypt are both active in the market for confectionaries. new trade theory actually tells us that many firms will participate in the production of the same products. Why? Because consumers want differentiation. There's differences in taste, just to name two reasons. So if we go to Europe, Europe has a very integrated market, and yet both France, Germany, and even Spain all produce motor vehicles at different levels of. But then, although they all produce motor vehicles, they're different in terms of their design, in terms of their quality, in terms of the amenities, the features that they offer. So in the very same way, even moving away from just the sugar market, we should hesitate from the idea that when we encounter a sector in Kenya that is struggling, what we want to ask is why it's not beating the rest of the world, or why we're not self-sufficient, which is also another bad idea. Alternatively, what we need is for the market itself to decide what the market will want to produce, because those households and firms in all around Kenya, they know what they want to do every day. They know what they're interested in. They know what skills they have, what attributes they, in terms of resources that they actually control, and they understand better how to allocate them than the government. So the government should be more focused in having the most efficient regulatory environment, and then allow the market to find its own equilibrium. So make it easy for the market to find its own equilibrium. Now, because we are actually in a state of we have protectionist measures that are built on intractable political economic relationships, it will take courage. So, which also brings us to the question about unintended consequences from prolonged protection. You could probably categorize all of them under the opportunity cost. What else could we have done with the money that the government spent to protect them? And what else could these farmers and these firms have? What other markets could they have been engaged in if they just found if they found themselves either being outcompeted in the sugar industry and then deciding to do something else, or deciding that they'll try and become competitive?
Okay, thank
And
you.
yeah,
Thank you. I hope those questions have been answered satisfactorily. Is there anyone else who want to voice their question? Still have another opportunity. Cannot see a hand up, but I see okay. I can't see a hand up, but there is one more question from Azenath. And Azenath asks, I think the question is related. The question is related to the others. So she asks, despite Kenya placing restrictions to protect local sugar producers, why are some Kenyan sugar companies still declining? I think there's another mix up there, because now the protection, she mentions producers and also the Kenyan companies declining because we've seen most of them struggle in closing at some time. So as you respond to that question, because we don't have any other questions, I hope you'll be able to make your concluding remarks as you respond to that. And for me, I hope that even as we go into the African free trade, the continental free trade, I hope that we will not also try to get into these safeguards. Or maybe if that happens, then we need to have very strong monitoring and evaluation of the performance against the objectives, and know actually when to exit. But that's a different conversation. And so I hope Emmanuel and Moses, you have a minute to respond to this question and give your concluding remarks. Emmanuel, go first.
Thanks. Can you please repeat the question? I don't see it here.
Okay, it's here under the Q&A. Despite Kenya placing restrictions to protect local sugar industry, sugar producers, okay, that's the sugar industry. Why are some Kenyan sugar companies still struggling? Why are they declining?
Yeah, I think one thing that our presentation shows is that on the aggregate, because they're being cushioned, they're not competitive. They're not investing in any types of measures to improve their productivity. So, because on the whole, what the data showed us is that productivity has barely increased. So then I expect, and taking from your question, that that some firms probably die off. So why they're declining? I think it's not sugar companies don't have to be strong or weak, or they don't have to prosper or decline. What we're interested in at the policy level is whether government policy is actually enabling or obstructing on the firm side, their productivity, their efficiency, and then on the household side, whether government is supporting firms at the expense of everyone else. Now, if some Kenyan sugar companies decline, whether it's their mismanagement or other issues, at least at the baseline of the discussion, what we should be concerned with is whether policy is actually influencing that. But I'll allow my colleague to expound on that with more. My concluding comment will be this: Kenya is a small, open economy. So it's a price taker in the world. It doesn't have bargaining power. We are, or rather, the nation's tea exporting firms are the only ones that dominate in any important way any global market. And they dominate in a market where there's probably nothing more that they can do for the next 100 or 200 years to tea to grow their market share, because there's just not more land being planted to grow that tea. So what Kenya should, at the highest level, be pursuing in terms of the organization of its market, citizens should be pushing for freer market with more efficient regulations, for a government that's smaller, and for the rule of law. So just the conditions for them to discover the equilibriums on their own. And then at the trade policy level, Kenya should actually pursue a unilateral policy of free trade. Does this mean that we are advocating, or that I am advocating for cruelty on the part of those households that that eke their livelihood on government protections or even direct government employment? No. Case by case, there would have to be discussions and agreements on some form of transition. But it's just untenable to continue to protect firms. We see empirically that the experience of nations like Hong Kong and Singapore for unilateral free trade is that you lower transaction costs for agreements, and we could see the results. We have very high per capita incomes. They have very high levels of innovation. Singapore doesn't produce sugar, and yet they're okay. I will end my comment there. Thank you.
Thanks. So to answer the question, well, firstly, just from an intuitive thinking here, nobody has an incentive to do work if you can still go not do the work and get paid. So one of the reasons why some of these factories declined is because, after all, they were assured that irrespective how inefficient they were would still be assured of the market because the market was ring fenced for them. And with those, they accumulated a lot of inefficiency. And with the time when those protection were relaxed at some point or something happened, then the decline must have come from that. So, and that's why we feel that we should have exited this safeguard way earlier than we did, because for 2 decades, that was a lot of time. And given, if you know that you have such a long time, or you understand that the Kenyan government allow you a lobbying chance every time the safeguard are being revised to be kept, then it lets the people in the line to actually be complacent on what they do and that. And I think that has been a major contributor to that. And it's important to notice that the government has done a lot of bailing out for these companies over time. And of course, the fact that it might take a lot to produce sugar, and Kenyan companies are not maybe best placed to do that, but they kept moving in that direction. That could be one of the explainers. But in my conclusion, like I said earlier, we support the exit from the COMESA sugar safeguard. This should have come way earlier. Maybe 15 years ago, this should have happened already. But we understand that the Kenyan policymaker or the Kenyan government might try to use other mechanism to still protect the sector, and especially because now that we're almost nearing an election period, and therefore, as we all know, the Western region voting might demand that. So first of all, we hope that you who are represented here with this knowledge, when you demand from government, you not demand that they protect the industry, but of a different thing. But even so, we hope that government, for example, is going to lift bans on importation, reduce tariffs on all other fronts, whether it's through EAC or whatever, so that it doesn't happen that we just exited the safeguard, but still remain to be protectionist on this case. But even so, we think that I hope this webinar shows you that there's a connection between policy, both on the domestic and international level, and life and welfare. And therefore, citizens should be more aware of what policy are we supporting, what are we asking for, and what is the best way to actually achieve that. Because at the end of the day, if policy is not bettering the lives of Kenyans, then it should be discarded, or people should look for better. And I think it's in the place of citizens to demand for better, or even to try and support better policy by asking the policymakers to lean toward a certain direction. We appreciate your presence here, and sorry for keeping you this late. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Moses and Emmanuel. And as Moses has concluded, we must be very active to participate in policy discussions, because some of these policies actually impact greatly in our lives. So we've had protectionism of the sugar subsector industry for 24 years. We've paid that through higher prices and additional cost in bailouts, and our productivity has not improved. And now we are exiting without achieving any of our intended goals. So look out for a blog post on the same, and a policy brief that will follow in a few days. I would really like to thank you for staying with us through this conversation, and I hope you'll be able to join us again. On Friday, we have another webinar, and we are assessing the implementation of Kenya's e-government procurement system. And our focus will be on the policy options and reform priorities. I hope you'll be able to join us in that. Thank you once again for staying with us through this. The presentation will be uploaded shortly so that you can access it, and the same will be uploaded. The webinar will be uploaded on our YouTube pages for your reference. Thanks everyone at IEA who contributed to making this possible. And I want to wish you a wonderful afternoon. Lastly, IEA is a membership organization, and I hope you will be interested and reach out to our communication team for more information on the same. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon.